Welcome to the Sleeptime History channel. Here we create immersive first-person stories from the pages of history, told gently through the eyes of those who lived them. Each episode invites you to step into moments of the past. Walk quietly beside emperors, explorers, revolutionaries, and forgotten heroes, not as distant names, but as real people experiencing history firsthand. Our aim is simple: to help you relax, transport you somewhere peaceful, and guide you gently into sleep. If you've enjoyed this experience, please consider liking and subscribing. It genuinely helps our channel grow, enabling us to create more soothing content for you. And if you'd like to leave a comment, we'd love to hear which historical figures or moments you'd like us to cover next. Your ideas inspire future episodes. Thank you for joining us. Now, relax and let history carry you softly towards sleep. In this episode, we step into the quiet thoughts of a British soldier during the Battle of the Somme. Through his eyes, we witness life in the trenches, moments of stillness, fear, friendship, and quiet endurance, told gently from within the mud and wire. Each scene is crafted to soothe the mind and slow the breath, offering a peaceful path through one of history's darkest chapters. Now, settle in and let the past carry you softly towards sleep. Part 1. Arrival at the front. The mud was the first thing that welcomed me. I stepped off the transport wagon and sank a good inch into the brown muck that blanketed everything, like a sickly skin stretched across the earth. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood, stale tobacco, and the faint, lingering tang of cordite. I remember the driver giving me a nod, as if to say, "This is it." And it was. The Somme. July 1916. I had joined the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry just months earlier, all fresh-faced and full of that naive courage they seemed to prize so highly back in training. They didn't tell us much, just that we were needed and that the Huns wouldn't last long. But by the time I arrived, the offensive had already begun, and the casualty lists were growing longer than anyone cared to admit. We were marched in single file past rows of duckboards, threading through shattered woods and collapsed dugouts. The sky was overcast, a grey shroud casting everything in a cold, colourless haze. And even though it was summer, there was a chill that crept through the seams of your tunic and into your bones. The trench lines stretched endlessly, like a scar torn into the countryside. It smelled of earth and sweat and something else, something metallic and old, like rusted iron. I was led to a dugout by a corporal named Tilly, who barely looked at me. "Private William Cooper," I said, offering my hand. He looked at it and didn't shake. "You'll be on watch first thing tomorrow," he muttered, before ducking into a narrow passageway, leaving me to find my way among the others. That first night, I barely slept. The constant rumble of artillery was like thunder rolling just over the hill, never ceasing. Every now and then, a flare would light up the sky, casting the trench in pale, ghostly light, and always, the distant cracks of rifle fire, like fingers drumming on the coffin lid of the world. I found a corner to settle in, between two sacks of sand, and stared at a photograph of my sister Emily. She was only 15. I used to tease her about the freckles on her nose. I imagined her reading by the fire, blissfully unaware that her brother was ankle-deep in filth and praying not to see dawn. The next morning, they gave me my post. I was to stand at the parapet for 2 hours, eyes scanning no man's land for movement. A rifle in my hands, a periscope beside me, and silence. No man's land was a ruin. Barbed wire twisted like broken cages. Shell holes gaped like open mouths. In the distance, a mangled tree stood alone, blackened and stripped of all but a few stubborn branches. It reminded me of the stories we were told as boys about the trees that never died, even when fire rained from the heavens. My thoughts wandered often during those hours. I found myself whispering little stories in my head, narrating the day, as if I were writing letters I knew I'd never send. There was something comforting in it, like I could turn the madness into something ordered, something quiet. That evening we shared our first hot meal in the line. Tinned stew, thick and salty. I was seated next to a lad named Reggie. He was from Leeds, like me, had a laugh like a steam kettle, and a missing front tooth. "Bet you're wishing you signed up for the Navy now, eh?" he said, elbowing me. I smiled, but I didn't have a clever reply. Just kept chewing. We both knew this was the easy part. The lull. The storm hadn't hit us yet. Later, Tilly gathered us around. Word had come down that a push might be coming soon. He didn't say when, just told us to be ready. That's when it really sank in, the weight of where we were. This wasn't training. This wasn't stories from older men in the pub. This was war. That night, I dreamt of Emily again, but this time, she was crying. Somewhere in the dark, a rat scurried across my chest and disappeared. I didn't move, just lay there and stared at the boards above me, listening to the endless sound of the guns, and wondered how a man ever came to call a trench his home. But I knew already that we had no choice. We were here, and the only way out was forward. Part 2. Life in the line. It didn't take long for routine to settle in. Strange as that sounds, war, it turns out, is a life of rhythms. Dawn stand to, morning rum, sentry duty, meals, if you could call them that, and the long uneasy stretches of silence broken by sudden roars. My body adjusted quickly, my mind slower. Mornings began in a kind of daze. The sun rarely pierced the low-hanging clouds, and the damp soaked everything. Boots, blankets, biscuits. We'd stand to arms in case of a dawn raid, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the shimmering fields ahead. Most days nothing happened, but we couldn't trust the stillness. It had a way of lulling you into carelessness, and that could be fatal. After stand to, we'd get our tot of rum, just enough to warm the chest, and then get on with trench maintenance, digging out collapsed walls, bailing out rainwater, repairing the duckboards. It was relentless. The trenches sagged and shifted, like they had minds of their own. Sometimes we joked they were trying to bury us alive before the enemy had the chance. One morning, I was assigned to a working party repairing the parapet near SAP 14. It was quiet. Too quiet. You start to suspect the silence is deliberate, like they're watching and waiting. As I passed a sandbag up to Reggie, I noticed him staring hard at a section of wire just past our front line. "See that?" he whispered. At first I didn't. Then, movement. A glint. Just for a second, gone again. "Sniper," he said, ducking low. We both crouched down, hearts pounding. We waited 5 minutes before creeping back. That's how it was. The fear didn't shout, it whispered. When we weren't working or on sentry, we talked, about home mostly. I told the lads about Emily and my dad's allotment. Reggie talked about his girl, Maggie. Said she'd promised to wait, though he wasn't sure if she meant it. There was a chaplain named Sergeant Palmer, who occasionally wandered through, handing out Bibles and chocolate. He'd give a kind word and a pat on the shoulder, never staying too long in one place. "Hope's a funny thing," he told me once. "It slips through cracks if you don't hold it tight." Evenings were the hardest. That's when the rats came. Big as cats, bold as officers. You'd hear them first, scratching, chewing, squealing. One of them ran off with half a tin of bully beef once. Reggie tried to chase it. Nearly fell into the latrine pit. We'd wrap ourselves in our greatcoats, lean against the trench wall, and wait for sleep to find us. Some nights it did. Others, you lay there with your heart beating in your ears, counting the seconds between shells. The worst was when the wind changed. When it blew from the enemy's lines, it brought with it the stench of death. Bodies left in no man's land, weeks old. You could taste it. It stuck to your skin, got in your mouth. We tied rags over our faces and tried not to breathe too deep. I once asked Tilly if it ever got easier. "No," he said, "but you get better at pretending it does." One day, orders came down for a wiring party that night. We were to crawl out under cover of darkness and repair a section of barbed wire that had been blown apart by shelling. I volunteered. Don't ask me why. Maybe I wanted to prove something, to the others, or to myself. We left just after midnight, 6 of us, crawling on our bellies, slow and silent, the moon behind thin clouds. Every rustle felt like a shout. My heart beat so loudly, I thought it might draw fire. I reached the broken section and began splicing wire with trembling hands. The metal bit into my fingers, but I dared not stop. Just keep moving, keep quiet, keep breathing. Then a flare. The whole world lit up in white. We froze. I pressed my face into the mud, praying I looked like just another corpse. My breath shallow, my rifle beside me. The light faded. No shots came. We finished quickly and returned to the trench, every nerve stretched thin. When we got back, Reggie handed me a cigarette. "You're one of us now," he said, grinning. I didn't smile back, just lit the smoke and stared out into the dark, where the flare had hung like a second sun. That night, I dreamt of the ocean. I was back in Scarborough, standing barefoot on the sand, the wind in my hair, Emily beside me, the world whole again. But then the sea turned black, and I woke to the sound of distant guns and the scent of cordite and mud. Morning had come again, and so had the war. Part 3. Whispers. Before the storm. It began with a rumour. Someone had overheard an officer speaking too loudly near the command dugout. Word spread quickly. Something big was coming. A push, a major advance. They were bringing in more artillery, new troops, even tanks, though none of us had seen one yet. All we knew was that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be like before. The whispers circled us like mist. Some lads grew quiet, staring off into the middle distance. Others joked too loudly, polishing their rifles for the 10th time, pretending they weren't afraid. But we were all afraid. That kind of fear doesn't go away. It just settles into your bones like the cold. Tilly gathered us for briefing one grey morning. He didn't sugarcoat it. "We're going over the top in 3 days. 0 hour to be confirmed. Till then, rest, prepare, and make peace where you need to." That was all. Reggie said nothing afterward. Just sat in silence, smoking. I think he'd always known this was coming. The preparations started immediately. Ammunition was handed out, equipment checked and rechecked. We were issued fresh rations, hardtack, bully beef, water, and something new, a small canvas bag with a crude gas mask. "In case," they said. In case. We also received extra socks, which made me laugh for some reason. I suppose someone somewhere thought dry feet might make all the difference. We wrote letters. That was the hardest part. I sat with my back against the trench wall and scribbled onto paper that smelled faintly of damp wool. I wrote to Emily, told her about the stars here, how they stretched wider than anything I'd seen in Yorkshire. I told her not to worry, that I was with good men, that I thought of her every night. I didn't say I was scared. I didn't say I might not come back. 2 days before the attack, we were moved to a forward position, closer to the front. The trench here was narrower, less stable, its walls patched with torn sandbags and broken duckboards. Shells fell at random, both ours and theirs. One landed just 20 yards away, sending a fountain of muck into the sky and showering us with mud and bits of twisted metal. A man named Harris was hit in the leg, screamed until they carried him back. There was no ceremony, just blood and bandages and silence afterward. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the stars again, their cold indifference stretching across the heavens. The air had a strange stillness to it, as if even the wind was holding its breath. The day before the attack, the bombardment began. We were told it would be continuous, relentless, designed to break the enemy's lines before we even got there. And it was. The guns behind us opened fire at dawn and didn't stop. The ground trembled, the air shook, the sky turned grey with smoke and dust. We could hear the shrieking whine of shells overhead, feel their impact through our boots, a deep rumbling roar that never ended. Some of the lads cheered when it started. "Give 'em hell," they shouted. But as the hours dragged on, the noise became unbearable. It was a kind of madness, a constant pounding in your chest and skull and teeth. You couldn't think, you couldn't speak. We stuffed cotton in our ears, wrapped scarves around our heads, tried everything to dull the sound. Nothing worked. The trench trembled as if the earth itself wanted to run. That evening, Palmer the chaplain came to speak with us. No sermon, no speech, just walked along the line, nodding, placing a hand on shoulders. He paused beside me and offered a small wooden cross. "I don't know if I believe," I admitted. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Just something to hold on to." I took it. As night fell, the shelling slowed slightly. We took the opportunity to eat, if you could call it eating. Dry biscuits, a lump of cheese, tea brewed in a rusted mess tin. We huddled close, speaking in low tones, sharing memories of home like they were precious relics. Reggie told me more about Maggie. Said she had red hair and a laugh that made the neighbours complain. She said I looked daft in uniform, he grinned, but said it like she was proud. I told him about Emily's terrible singing voice, how she used to sing while baking, completely off-key. We laughed quietly, then sat in silence. You start to notice the little things, the smell of damp wool, the creak of a canteen strap, the way the trench seems to breathe around you. It becomes a kind of world, separate from everything else, a place suspended in time, and tomorrow we'd be leaving it. The night before, we were given final instructions. Our unit would go over first light. The whistles would blow. We'd climb the ladders, push through the gap in the wire, and advance across no man's land toward the enemy trench. We were told to keep formation, keep heads down, keep moving. Simple words for an impossible task. I lay down that night with my pack beneath my head and the wooden cross in my palm. I thought of home, of the fire in the hearth, of the sound of waves at Scarborough Beach, of Emily's freckles. I didn't sleep. None of us did. We just waited, listening to the breath of the trench and the distant rumble of guns. And as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, we rose in silence. Tomorrow had come. Part 4, Over the Top. They blew the whistle just after first light. It was a thin, reedy sound. Strange that such a small thing could signal something so massive. But there it was, cutting through the muffled stillness, like a blade. We looked at one another. No words, just nods and a final breath. Reggie was beside me. He gave a weak smile, then climbed. I followed. The world narrowed into a blur of motion and sound. My boots hit the fire step, then the ladder. My fingers grasped the top edge of the trench. I pulled myself up and over. No man's land spread out before me. A muddy wasteland of shell craters and broken wire. The morning light caught on the wet earth, casting a pale shimmer across the field. Smoke hung low, drifting like fog. Somewhere far behind, the artillery was still pounding, but it felt distant, as if muffled by cotton. And then we were running. My legs moved on instinct, one foot then the next, pushing through mud that sucked at my heels. Bullets cracked overhead, sharp slicing sounds. You couldn't see where they came from, only feel the air shift as they passed too close. Men were falling. Some shouted, some didn't. A few dropped silently, their limbs folding in strange ways. But we kept moving. The training took over. We were told not to stop, not to help, not to look back. Just keep moving, keep your head down, keep pushing forward. I don't remember reaching the halfway point. Time didn't seem to exist. Only the pounding of my heart, the sting of the cold air, the weight of my rifle in my hands. Reggie was still beside me. Mud splashed his face, his mouth open, yelling something I couldn't hear. Then the ground exploded to my right. I hit the earth hard, thrown sideways by the blast. My ears rang, everything spun. I tasted dirt and blood. When I opened my eyes, the sky looked darker. I lay still, afraid to move. A body landed near me, face down, one boot missing. I blinked, tried to breathe, and slowly crawled forward. Every inch was a battle. My legs ached, my hands bled. I passed a tangle of barbed wire, shredded and scorched. One of our lads hung from it, motionless. I forced myself onward, crawling like a worm through the muck. Eventually, I reached a shallow dip, a shell hole just deep enough to provide some cover. I dropped into it, gasping, heart hammering. My fingers clutched the edge as I peered toward the enemy trench. It was still far. Too far. Others began to gather in the hole. Tilly arrived next, mud coating his uniform, blood trickling down his temple. He nodded at me, said nothing. Then Reggie dropped in, coughing, gasping, eyes wide with shock. "You all right?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just sat there, staring at his hands. We stayed in that hole for what felt like hours. The ground shook with each new shell. Dirt rained down on us. Sometimes bits of metal too. We didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed, waited, prayed. Eventually, Tilly looked up. "We go on," he said, and somehow we did. We climbed out of the hole and moved again. Slower now, crawling, ducking, sprinting in short bursts. Every few steps, someone else dropped. I stopped keeping count. We neared the enemy wire, what was left of it. The bombardment had torn gaps in places, but other sections still bristled like thorns. We found an opening and pushed through. The trench loomed ahead. I remember thinking it didn't look like much, just a jagged line in the dirt, smoke rising behind it. But it was everything. Our goal, our nightmare. We reached the edge. Tilly went in first, disappearing over the lip with a roar. Reggie followed, then me. Inside it was chaos, mud and blood and bodies everywhere. Smoke so thick you could barely see. The enemy was there. Young men, wide-eyed, terrified. Some fought, some didn't. I saw a German lad no older than me drop his rifle and raise his hands. He was shaking. I hesitated. Then someone behind me shouted, and the moment passed. The rest is a blur, yelling, clashing, the smell of fire and flesh, and then silence. Somehow we had taken the trench. I stood there, gasping, surrounded by the living and the dead. My uniform torn, my face streaked with mud and sweat, and something else. I didn't want to know what. Tilly slumped against the wall, bleeding from his arm. He gave a half smile. "Well done, lads," he said, voice hoarse. "Hold it now." We did. We held. Reggie sat down, back to the trench wall, and pulled out a cigarette with shaking fingers. "That was hell," he muttered. I didn't answer, just sat beside him, numb. As the sun rose higher, the noise faded. The guns quieted. The smoke thinned, and we were left with silence, and with it, the reckoning. We began counting who was left, calling names, listening for replies that didn't come. Some answered, many didn't. We laid the bodies in rows as best we could, marked them with tags when we could find them, covered their faces. One lad, Tommy, I think his name was, had written a letter in his breast pocket. We found it, stained but legible. It began, "Tell Mum I'm sorry." Reggie read it out loud. No one spoke. Later that night, after the trench had been reinforced and we'd been allowed a few hours of rest, I sat beneath a piece of torn canvas and stared at my hands. They were still shaking, but I was alive. I had gone over the top, crossed no man's land, and lived. And yet, a part of me remained back there, in the mud, in the noise, in the eyes of the boy who surrendered, in the silence that followed. We won that ground, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like loss, painted in earth and blood. Part 5. Holding the line. We held the trench through the night, cold and shivering under the dim light of a waxing moon. No fires, no noise, just the rustle of movement and the occasional muttered word, like a ghost whispering through the ruins. The German trench we had taken wasn't much better than our own. Narrow, cracked, half collapsed in places. It stank of damp and smoke, and something else I didn't want to identify. Blood pooled in low spots, rifles lay abandoned. A helmet, torn at the rim, rested on a mound of dirt like some strange offering. Our orders were to dig in, reinforce, wait. We worked in silence, digging with our hands when our entrenching tools snapped. We used corpses to support sandbags. There was no time to bury the dead, not properly. So we stepped over them, worked beside them, spoke softly when near them, as if they might still hear. Reggie barely spoke. His eyes seemed stuck somewhere else, somewhere past the wire and the mud and the blood. Tilly's wound had been bound tight, and he refused to rest. He moved among us like a ghost, issuing short orders, checking every firing step, every loophole, every makeshift barricade. "Stay sharp," he said. "They'll counter, maybe tonight." And counter they did. It came just after midnight. A flare went up, burning white against the dark. Then came the shouting, the clatter of boots, the bark of machine guns. Bullets sliced through the air, snapping past our ears like angry wasps. We fired back. Blindly, at first, just noise and flashes and smoke. Then more deliberately. I saw shadows running through the fog and squeezed the trigger again and again until my shoulder ached and my fingers were raw. A man beside me screamed and fell. Another ducked, only to be hit moments later. But we held. We held. Reggie and I shared a look between bursts. There was no fear left, only a dull, grinding instinct. Survive. Protect the line. Survive again. The attack lasted 20 minutes, maybe more. Time stretched and snapped, folding in on itself. Eventually, the noise faded, and the night grew still once more. We waited, silent, listening. Nothing. Then slowly, we exhaled. At first light, we crept from cover and surveyed the damage. The trench was scarred, new holes blown in the walls, bodies in heaps, gear strewn across the boards. But we'd repelled them, for now. Tilly sat down against the trench wall and closed his eyes. "Good work," he murmured. "Bloody good work." That was the first time I saw him look human. Just a tired man with a bleeding arm and too many ghosts behind his eyes. Later that day, a runner brought word. We were to hold the position for another 48 hours until reinforcements arrived. No retreat, no relief. We nodded, wordless. What choice did we have? We rotated sentries, patched holes, shared out the rations, though they were running low. Reggie gave me half of his biscuit without a word. I didn't argue. A few of the new lads had never seen combat before. Their hands shook as they loaded rifles. One of them, Hobbs, I think, vomited in the corner after seeing a body twisted in barbed wire. I wanted to comfort him, tell him it would pass, that it got easier, but it didn't. You just got used to it. The next night, we took turns sleeping in shifts, short, broken spells of rest interrupted by the occasional shot or shell. I dreamt of home again, the smell of bread, Emily laughing in the garden, my father waving from the gate. I woke with tears on my cheeks. I wiped them away before anyone could see. During the quiet hours, Reggie and I talked in low tones. About nothing, really. Books we liked, foods we missed, people we'd kissed once and never seen again. "Do you think we'll make it out?" he asked once. I didn't answer. He didn't press. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a small worn photograph of Maggie. Her smile was crooked, her eyes bright. "I carry her with me," he said. "Everywhere." I nodded. Me too. I didn't mean Maggie, of course, but he understood. We found a piano buried under rubble the next day. Just the frame, really. Keys missing, strings snapped, but someone managed to plink out a few broken notes. A tune we couldn't name, but one that somehow brought comfort. Music in the trenches, who'd have thought? A few of us hummed along, quietly, just for a minute. Then the moment passed and the guns resumed in the distance. That evening the chaplain came again. Palmer. He brought us bread, wine, and quiet words. No sermons, just presence. He stood beside the dead and whispered prayers, touching each forehead like a father seeing his children to bed. He asked if anyone wanted to speak. One lad did. Told a story about his mum's garden. Another recited a line of poetry. I don't remember the words, only the hush that followed. When it came to me, I said nothing, just nodded. Palmer touched my shoulder, then moved on. As darkness fell once more, we lit no lamps, sat in the quiet, ears tuned to the wind. It was strange, after all the noise, to find such stillness again. Reggie passed me a scrap of paper. "Write," he said, so I did. "Dear Emily, we're still holding, still standing. The lads are tired, but they're good men. I've seen things I can't explain, felt things I don't yet understand. But I'm thinking of you, of home, of the quiet and the light and the sea. If I come back, I'll never complain about the cold again. Lover, William. That night, we slept fitfully, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. But for now, we held the line. We were still here. Part 6. The Long Wait. The relief came at dawn. We were half asleep when the call went out. Fresh men arriving from the rear, helmets too clean, eyes too wide. A few of us stood and stared at them like ghosts, too tired to speak. They passed us with nervous glances, and I could see the thoughts behind their eyes. Is this what we'll look like in a week? Tilly gave the handover orders, sharp but steady. He never showed fatigue, not in front of them. We gathered our gear, such as it was, and began the trudge back through the communication trenches, step after step through muck and wire and the smell of old gunpowder. Reggie walked beside me, limping slightly from a knock to the knee. We didn't talk. There wasn't much to say. We left behind the trench we had fought for, left behind the faces of men we knew, still wrapped in ponchos or shrouded in tarp, left behind a part of ourselves, buried in the mud. They took us to a reserve trench half a mile back. It was better, less shelling, dry even. We were allowed to sleep, real sleep, not half wakefulness with a rifle on your chest. I collapsed into my blanket and didn't wake until evening. When I did, it took me a moment to remember where I was. The air was quieter. A breeze rustled the canvas above us. Somewhere, someone was singing low, the words lost on the wind. For the first time in days, I felt human again. They gave us warm food, though I hardly tasted it. Tea thick with sugar. Stew, mostly turnips. A slice of bread that wasn't entirely hard. Reggie sat across from me, boots off, inspecting a blister the size of a shilling. "That's a souvenir," he muttered. I nodded. Tilly came by to check on us. His arm was bound tighter now. The bleeding slowed. "We'll be out of the line for a week," he said. "Maybe more. Make the most of it." We nodded, but none of us really believed it. Time was elastic here. Days stretched, hours blurred. A week could vanish with a single telegram. The next morning, I found a quiet spot near the edge of the trench and sat with my notebook. I wrote another letter to Emily, though I didn't know if the last had even reached her. I told her we'd had a small victory, that I was safe, that I missed the sound of rain on the roof back home and the smell of Mum's baking. I told her to keep studying, to keep drawing, to keep being herself. I didn't tell her about the boy in the wire, or the trench we slept in, or the eyes of the German lad who had surrendered before a bullet took him from behind. Some things belonged to the war, not to her. During our rest period, we were assigned lighter duties, cleaning rifles, writing reports, checking stores. I didn't mind. It gave my hands something to do, stopped my thoughts from spiralling. One afternoon, we were asked to escort a small group of prisoners back to the rear. They were young, our age, mud-streaked, silent, eyes lowered. One limped, supported by a comrade. None of them looked at us with hate, just exhaustion. Reggie walked beside one and offered him a cigarette. The lad accepted it with a shaky hand. No words passed between them, but the gesture said enough. We washed when we could, stripped to our waists and dunked ourselves in rain barrels. The cold water bit hard, but it lifted something from the skin, if not from the soul. I scraped mud from under my nails and stared at my reflection in the rippling surface. I looked older, not in years but in weight. There was a weariness behind my eyes that hadn't been there in July, and it was still only summer. We spoke more freely during those days, laughed even. Jokes about home, about the officers, about the awful stew. Reggie had us in stitches with a story about his father mistaking a goat for a postman. It felt good, real, like a window had opened and let in fresh air. But the war was never far. Every now and then we'd hear the thud of distant guns or see stretchers carried past by silent orderlies, men with bandages over their eyes or arms gone, or whispering to someone who wasn't there, reminders. I saw Palmer again. He was always calm, always composed. He handed me a fresh Bible, though I hadn't asked for one. "I thought you might want to press your letters inside it," he said with a smile. I did. He told me the line had shifted again, that we'd gained a few 100 yards, that it had cost hundreds of lives. He didn't say more. What was there to say? On the 5th day of rest, we received word. We'd be moving up again soon. No one groaned, no one objected. We just nodded and began gathering our kit. Reggie looked at me as he packed. Think we'll be lucky again? I shrugged. Don't know. He held up Maggie's photograph, kissed it, and slipped it into his tunic. Maybe she's the lucky one, he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay under the stars, the sky unusually clear. I traced constellations with my eyes, Orion, Cassiopeia, the Plough. It reminded me of home. I imagined Emily looking at the same stars somewhere far away. I hoped she was warm. I hoped she was safe. In the morning we formed up, rifles slung, boots tightened, eyes forward. The wind carried the scent of wet grass and burnt cordite. The sky was grey again, the sun hidden. Tilly led the column, Reggie beside him, me just behind, back toward the front, back toward the line, back into the waiting mud and smoke and silence. But for a moment, as we walked, I felt a strange calm, as if the earth itself had paused, as if, for just a breath, the world had remembered peace. Part 7. Back to the mud. We returned to the front under a sky thick with clouds, boots sinking into soft earth that seemed determined to keep us. The trench line had shifted slightly during our rest. No longer the one we'd fought to hold, but one adjacent, deeper into the wreckage. Everything felt familiar, and yet strangely new. The sounds, the smells, the way the boards creaked beneath our steps, like coming back to a place that no longer remembered you. Tilly was quieter than usual. The wound on his arm had healed enough for him to keep it tucked under his greatcoat, but the stiffness in his gait remained. Reggie had a slight cough now, nothing serious but persistent. He laughed it off, said he probably just missed the stew. The trench we inherited had clearly seen action. The walls sagged, sandbags split from rain and shrapnel, duckboards loose underfoot. The lads before us had left in a hurry. Spent casings littered the fire step, and in one corner, someone had scrawled "Still here" in charcoal across the boards. It felt more like a warning than a statement. That night, we resumed the familiar rhythm. Stand to at dusk, rifles readied, bayonets fixed. The sky pulsed occasionally with distant flashes, artillery or lightning. It was hard to say. We spoke less now, not out of fear, but routine. The jokes came slower. The silences stretched longer. Even Reggie seemed to drift, his eyes always searching the dark horizon, like it might answer something he hadn't yet asked aloud. I sat beside him on the fire step, both of us watching the pale flicker of flares. You ever think about after? He asked suddenly. After what? This, the war. I paused. Sometimes. What do you see? I thought for a moment. Quiet. A cottage somewhere, near the sea. Emily would visit. I'd fix things. Read books. Just quiet. Reggie nodded slowly. Maggie wants to open a shop. A little one. Sweets and papers. Says she'll name it after her gran. He smiled faintly, then coughed again. We went on a wiring patrol 2 nights later. Just the 3 of us. Tilly, Reggie and me. Out past our trench. Crawling low. Laying fresh coils of barbed wire to replace what had been blown apart. It was a moonless night, cold, damp. We worked quickly, hands numb, listening for any sound, any movement. The silence was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. Halfway through the task, Reggie froze. Did you hear that? We stopped, waited, nothing. Probably rats, Tilly whispered. We finished the job and made it back without incident, but something stayed with me. A feeling, like we'd brushed against something just out of sight. The next morning orders came through. We were to hold and await further instruction. More offensives were coming. The Somme was far from over. That afternoon I helped bury a soldier from another unit. No one knew his name. He had no tags, just a photo of a woman in his breast pocket and a half-written letter addressed to "My Darling." We wrapped him in a ground sheet, said a few quiet words, and marked the grave with a wooden cross fashioned from trench boards. Palmer came later to bless it. He placed the letter inside a small tin and buried it with the man. "Every name matters," he said. That night, Reggie's cough got worse. He brushed it off again, but I could see the strain behind his eyes. "You should see the medic," I said. "I will," he replied. After breakfast, he never made it. At stand to, we came under sudden bombardment. No warning, just thunder and fire and smoke. The trench shook as shells rained down, closer and closer. The blast threw me backwards. My ears rang. Dirt and splinters filled the air. When I came to, the trench was in pieces. Sections collapsed, men shouting, digging with bare hands, calling out names. I found Reggie under a pile of boards, blood on his tunic, face pale. He was breathing. Just. I called for help. We lifted him out, carried him to the aid post. He squeezed my hand once weakly. Then he was gone. They took his body away before nightfall, said they'd bury him in the rear area, mark it properly. I gave them the photo of Maggie. Tilly stood beside me, silent. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That night I wrote again. "Dear Emily, we lost Reggie today. He was my friend, a good man. Funny, kind, brave. I want you to remember his name. Reggie. He loved a girl named Maggie who laughed too loud and promised to wait for him. He was afraid like all of us, but he kept going. Tell Dad I'm fine. I'm tired, but I'm fine. Tell him I still remember how to plant potatoes. Love, William." The days that followed blurred into routine again. Work, watch, wait. The mud never changed. The guns never truly stopped. But something inside me had shifted. I moved slower, spoke less. At night, I stared at the stars and tried to remember Reggie's laugh. Sometimes I heard it, just faintly, and sometimes I didn't. One evening, Palmer sat beside me on the fire step. We didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Grief is love, with nowhere to go." I nodded. He handed me a small wooden token. "For your friend," he said. I held it in my palm, warm from his hand. I didn't cry, not then. And so I remained, in the trench, in the war, in the waiting. Still here, still remembering. Reflections. Part 1. The Aftermath of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme ended on the 18th of November 1916, after nearly 5 months of relentless fighting. The ground, soaked in rain and blood, was left scarred with shell holes, shattered trees, and lines of barbed wire stretching across a broken landscape. The battle had begun with hope. Hope for a breakthrough, hope that the war could be ended swiftly. But by its conclusion, that hope had been swallowed by the mud. More than 1 million men were killed or wounded on both sides. British and French forces had advanced only around 6 miles at the deepest points, while the German army, though bloodied and exhausted, had managed to maintain its defensive lines for much of the front. The scale of the losses stunned the world and reshaped the way war was perceived by those at home and abroad. In Britain, the Somme became a symbol of both bravery and futility. Stories of entire battalions of young men cut down in minutes, especially the PALS battalions, groups of friends and colleagues who had joined up together, left a deep and lasting trauma. The first day of the battle alone saw nearly 60,000 British casualties. For many families, the news came in waves of telegrams and whispers, and for entire communities, grief arrived like a tide. In the months that followed the battle, the surviving soldiers were pulled back from the front, replaced by new recruits. Some were granted short periods of leave. Many, however, were simply moved along to the next sector to continue the grinding war of attrition on other parts of the Western Front. The lessons learned, or half learned, at the Somme would shape the way future battles were planned and fought. Strategically, the battle revealed much. It exposed the limitations of traditional military thinking in an industrial age. Long bombardments, once believed to clear the way for easy infantry advances, were shown to be tragically ineffective against deeply dug German positions. Communication lines, still reliant on runners and field telephones, often collapsed under the pressure of battle. Even the tanks used for the first time during the Somme in September 1916 were primitive and unreliable, though they hinted at the future of mechanized warfare. But the Somme did have consequences beyond its immediate horror. It wore down the German army. The constant pressure forced the Germans to reconsider their defensive tactics. In early 1917, they began a strategic withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, a shorter, more defensible position that allowed them to conserve manpower and consolidate strength. This withdrawal was partly a result of the attritional strain imposed by battles like the Somme and Verdun. For the Allies, especially the British, the Somme marked a turning point in terms of experience and leadership. The British Army in 1916 was still largely an amateur force, composed of volunteers and newly commissioned officers. The High Command struggled with inexperience and poor coordination. By 1917, the army was becoming more professional, more skilled in combined arms tactics, and better able to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. Back home, public perception was changing too. Early enthusiasm had been tempered by the grim realities of the battlefield. Letters, photographs, and reports brought home the mud, the lice, the constant shell fire. News of the Somme reached households through both official reports and personal stories, sometimes censored, sometimes raw and unfiltered. The battlefields of France became etched into the national consciousness. And then slowly, society began to shift. The role of women had changed. With so many men away at war, women had filled roles in factories, farms, hospitals, and transport. The war had opened the door to a broader social movement, one that would, in time, lead to greater rights and recognition. The Somme, and battles like it, weren't just fought by those in uniform. The home front bore its own kind of burden, and its own kind of transformation. In the months following the battle, cemeteries began to take shape. The dead, so many of them unidentified, were buried where they fell, or in rows beneath white crosses. The Imperial War Graves Commission, later the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, was formed to ensure proper remembrance. Names were engraved, stones were aligned. Silence began to settle over the fields where chaos had once reigned. Artists, poets, and writers who had survived began to give voice to what had happened. Some wrote of honour and duty, others spoke of waste and silence. In the words of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, the Somme found its poetry, not triumphant but haunted. In paintings, the devastation of the land was captured in twisted trees and blasted horizons. A new kind of war art was born, honest, reflective, and often quietly damning. The Somme did not end the war, but it helped define it. It marked a transition from old ideals to new realities. The men who returned from those fields, if they returned at all, carried memories that could not be erased, and those who did not return became part of something larger, a shared memory, stitched into the fabric of the 20th century. Though the guns fell silent in November 1916 along the Somme, the echoes of that summer and autumn would continue to ripple across Europe. For decades, it was not just a battle. It was a fracture in time, a moment when the world was forced to see itself more clearly, in blood and mud and silence. Part 2. A War Transformed. When the guns fell quiet at the Somme, the Western Front did not return to peace. It shifted. What emerged from that bitter campaign was not a path to victory, but a transformation. The Somme had changed the face of warfare, altered the rhythm of battles, and forced generals, engineers, and politicians to reimagine what modern conflict would demand. Tactically, the Somme proved that the old ways could no longer achieve meaningful breakthroughs. Marching lines of men across open ground, with rifles and bayonets against machine guns and artillery, had become unthinkable. Though the British and French had made small territorial gains, these had come at a staggering cost, measured not just in land, but in the lives of entire generations. The Western Front had become a chessboard, where every square was soaked in blood. The battle's lessons were studied with urgency. One of the clearest developments was a new emphasis on combined arms warfare, the careful coordination of infantry, artillery, air power, and emerging technologies like tanks. During the early days of the Somme, bombardments were expected to destroy enemy defences entirely. In reality, they often only served to warn the Germans of an impending attack. Now, artillery would be refined into a more precise instrument. Creeping barrages, where shells landed just ahead of advancing troops, became standard practice. Communication also had to evolve. At the Somme, messages had frequently been lost in the chaos of battle. Runners were killed, telephone lines were severed by shellfire, carrier pigeons and signal flags were unreliable under fire. The failures to communicate cost lives and coordination. In the months and years that followed, more durable and flexible methods of field communication were explored, including wireless radio, still in its infancy but quickly gaining importance. In the air, too, the war was changing. The Battle of the Somme had seen the growing role of aircraft. Observation balloons and reconnaissance planes had provided vital intelligence on enemy positions. The skies over the trenches became contested spaces, with dogfights between biplanes adding a new, surreal layer to the war. By the end of 1916, control of the air had become a strategic goal in its own right, laying the groundwork for modern aerial warfare. One of the more experimental innovations at the Somme had been the tank. First deployed in September 1916 at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, these clanking metal machines astonished friend and foe alike. Though prone to mechanical failure and often bogged down in mud, they offered something previously unimaginable: the ability to cross no man's land under armour, crush barbed wire, and withstand small arms fire. Their early promise was uneven, but they sparked a revolution. Within 2 years, tanks would play a pivotal role in breaking the deadlock on the Western Front. Beyond tactics and machines, there was a shift in mindset. For many soldiers and commanders alike, the romantic notions of war, honour, chivalry, glory, were irretrievably gone. In their place came a grim acceptance. War was now industrial, impersonal, and total. Victories would not be swift or sweeping, but ground out slowly, inch, by managing logistics, manpower, and endurance. The Germans, too, absorbed the lessons of the Somme. The staggering losses had made it clear that rigid lines of defence were vulnerable. In response, they introduced a more flexible system of defence in depth. Rather than concentrating troops in the front line, they constructed multiple layers of defences. Lightly held forward trenches, stronger secondary positions, and mobile reserves capable of launching counterattacks. This approach made future Allied offensives even more difficult and costly. Morale, meanwhile, became a front of its own. At the Somme, prolonged exposure to horror had left deep psychological wounds. Though the term shell shock was already in use, it was poorly understood and often dismissed as cowardice. After the battle, military doctors and commanders began to grasp the scale of the mental toll. New methods of rest, rotation, and psychological care, limited as they were, began to appear across the armies. The rear lines changed too. Supply chains, once secondary to battlefield tactics, became central. A modern army required food, munitions, fuel, clothing, horses and spare parts, all in vast quantities. The Somme had exposed just how difficult it was to keep an army of hundreds of thousands functioning for months on end. Railways were extended, depots expanded, supply officers became as critical as generals. On the political front, the pressure of the Somme contributed to broader shifts. In Britain, public faith in the military leadership began to waver. Criticism of Sir Douglas Haig, the British commander-in-chief, grew louder, though he remained in post. The sheer scale of casualties sparked debates in Parliament and in newspapers. War poetry and letters from the front began to circulate more widely, sometimes revealing truths that official bulletins did not. At the same time, the war effort became increasingly total. In Britain, conscription was expanded, and civilian industry was further redirected to support the army. The Somme had shown that voluntary recruitment could not sustain the pace of losses. Factories ran day and night. New weapons were tested. Propaganda intensified. The war was no longer just a fight between armies. It was a national struggle for survival. The Somme also forced the Allies to think more collectively. Though the British and French had coordinated their efforts, cracks in communication and cooperation had been evident. Plans were often misaligned. Supplies were stretched. After the battle, deeper efforts were made to unify command structures and share intelligence. As the war dragged into its third year, the need for strategic cohesion grew ever more urgent. By early 1917, change was in motion. German forces began their retreat to the Hindenburg Line, a fortified position they had prepared well behind the current front. It was a tacit admission that holding every inch of land was no longer sustainable. This withdrawal allowed the Germans to shorten their lines, strengthen defences, and prepare for a war that had shifted from offence to attrition. And yet, in spite of all this evolution, in tactics, in leadership, in equipment, the war remained, at heart, the same grim struggle. Trenches still stretched across France and Belgium. Men still huddled in the cold. Shells still rained down day and night. What the Somme had revealed, perhaps more than anything else, was that no single battle could end this war. It had become a conflict of endurance, of grinding momentum, of waiting for a decisive shift that might never come. The lessons of the Somme were being absorbed, quietly, reluctantly, painfully, but they were there, buried beneath the mud and blood and ruin, and in the long months ahead, they would begin to shape a new kind of warfare, one still full of suffering, but slowly becoming more capable, more modern, and eventually more effective. Part 3. The War at Home. While soldiers endured the horrors of the Somme, a different kind of struggle unfolded across Britain. The war touched every corner of the country, not with bullets or shells, but with empty chairs at dinner tables, rationing in the shops, and the quiet persistence of daily life lived in the shadow of loss. The impact of the Somme and the First World War more broadly rippled outward from the trenches and into the very structure of society. By the end of 1916, nearly 2 years into the war, the optimism and patriotism that had coloured the early days of the conflict had begun to fade. The Battle of the Somme, with its long casualty lists and seemingly modest gains, shifted public opinion. No longer could victory be imagined as swift or glorious. Instead, the war became an endurance test for soldiers and civilians alike. Families waited for news with a mixture of dread and hope. The telegram, once a novelty, had become a symbol of fear. To receive one was to fear the worst. The knock at the door, the solemn delivery, the carefully chosen words, it became a ritual of grief repeated thousands of times. In towns and villages across the country, memorials began to appear. In many places, there were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. The dead of the Somme, like so many of that war, often lay unidentified in distant fields. Yet life at home did not and could not stand still. The war demanded not just soldiers, but also a vast infrastructure of support. The British government, recognising the growing needs of the army, implemented sweeping changes to the home front. Industry was reorganised, supply chains redirected, and new policies introduced to sustain the war effort. Perhaps most visibly, the role of women began to change. With hundreds of thousands of men fighting overseas, women stepped into roles that had once been closed to them. They worked in munitions factories, drove trams, delivered post, staffed hospitals, and took on agricultural work through the Women's Land Army. In doing so, they kept the country functioning and increasingly proved their capability in spheres once deemed the preserve of men. This shift was not merely practical, it was social. Attitudes toward gender, class, and labour began to evolve. Though the war did not deliver immediate equality, it cracked open the door. In 1918, just 2 years after the Somme, British women over the age of 30 gained the right to vote. This change was not solely because of their wartime contributions, but the war certainly helped accelerate the case for reform. Meanwhile, rationing and shortages became part of everyday life. Though food rationing did not begin officially until 1918, prices had already soared by late 1916. Import disruptions and the prioritization of supplies for the military created strain. The public was encouraged to grow their own vegetables, to waste nothing, and to make do. The dig for victory spirit, later popularized in the Second World War, had its early roots in the First. News and propaganda also played a growing role in shaping how the home front experienced the war. Newspapers published censored, but still harrowing accounts of the fighting. Films were made to bolster morale and show the army in a positive light. One of the most famous was The Battle of the Somme, a British documentary released during the battle itself. It combined real footage from the front lines with staged scenes, and was watched by millions, bringing the war home in a way never before possible. This early form of mass media blurred the line between reality and narrative. While it gave civilians a glimpse of the trenches, it also sanitized the experience. The mud, the rats, the mutilation, and the despair, these were often omitted or softened. Still, the emotional impact was profound. Families watched the screen and scanned the faces, wondering if their sons or husbands might appear. It was a new kind of mourning, a shared, silent acknowledgement of collective sacrifice. In schools and workplaces, the war changed rhythms and routines. Students knitted socks and packed care boxes for soldiers. Fundraisers and drives collected money for hospitals and ambulances. Patriotic posters adorned walls. The sense that everyone had a role to play became a kind of social contract. To question the war, especially in the early years, was seen as almost unpatriotic. But after the Somme, quiet doubts began to emerge. This growing skepticism was not universal, but it did spread. The war poets, many of whom had served at the front, began to capture a different tone. Not the martial pride of 1914, but the disillusionment of 1916 and beyond. In the writings of Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and others, civilians found a voice for the unease they couldn't always name. The Somme gave rise not only to graves, but to literature that would shape the way the war was remembered for generations. Economic shifts were equally profound. War production created jobs, but inflation eroded wages. Working-class families already living close to the edge felt the squeeze. Strikes and labour disputes did not disappear, they were simply framed in new ways. The government, keen to maintain productivity, introduced measures like the Munitions of War Act, which restricted workers' rights to strike and regulated factory conditions. The state was becoming more involved in everyday life, another legacy of the war. By late 1916, conscription had replaced voluntary enlistment. The scale of losses at the Somme had made it clear that Britain could no longer rely on volunteers alone. The Military Service Act had been passed earlier in the year, and by the end of 1916, more and more men were being called up. This, too, changed the fabric of society. The randomness of who was taken and who was not created tension, as did the appearance of conscientious objectors, men who refused to fight on moral or religious grounds. They were often ostracized or imprisoned, but their presence reminded the public that not all saw war as honourable. As the war dragged into 1917, the home front had become a complex web of endurance, adaptation, and grief. The Somme had left its mark not just on maps, but on hearts and minds. Communities were quieter now. Church bells rang less for weddings, more for funerals. Black armbands and mourning veils were common sights. children grew up faster. The war was not happening over there, it was everywhere. And yet life continued, babies were born, songs were sung, people fell in love. Even in the shadow of the Somme, the resilience of daily life endured. The trauma was deep, but so too was the instinct to keep going, to put one foot in front of the other, to wait for letters, to hope for peace. The legacy of the home front during and after the Somme is one of quiet strength. It is found not in grand battles, but in small moments, a meal stretched to feed more than it should, a candle lit in a window, a mother holding her grief close and carrying on. In the end, this was a different kind of battlefield, less visible perhaps, but no less heroic. Part 4. The Shifting Tide, 1917 and the Evolution of Strategy. The year following the Battle of the Somme, 1917, brought new challenges and further transformations to the First World War. The war was far from over, but the battlefields and strategies were evolving. While the trauma of the Somme lingered in every decision and dispatch, it was clear to both sides that the war would not be won by traditional means. New fronts opened, new alliances formed, and fresh offensives were planned, all while the weary soldiers and civilians endured yet another year of sacrifice. For the Allies, the most immediate consequence of the Somme was the need for re-evaluation. The battle had demonstrated that massive offensives could inflict heavy losses without yielding decisive results. As winter settled over the Western Front in late 1916, commanders reflected on what had gone wrong. The British and French armies recognised the need to innovate, or risk becoming mired in perpetual stalemate. One of the earliest major offensives of 1917 was the Nivelle Offensive, launched by the French in April, promised by General Robert Nivelle as a breakthrough that would end the war in 48 hours. It turned into a costly disaster. French troops suffered heavy casualties, and the failure shattered morale. Widespread mutinies erupted across the French army. Entire units refused to return to the front. Though the mutinies were eventually suppressed and reforms introduced to improve conditions, the episode revealed the immense strain. In the wake of these events, the British took the lead on the Western Front, launching the Third Battle of Ypres, often referred to as Passchendaele, in July 1917. Intended to break through German lines and reach the Belgian coast, the offensive became infamous for its mud, shell-churned terrain and appalling conditions. Rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Soldiers drowned in the muck. Progress was painfully slow. Though the Allies eventually captured the village of Passchendaele, the cost was staggering. Nearly 250,000 casualties for minimal strategic gain. Like the Somme, Passchendaele came to symbolise the brutal futility of attritional warfare. Yet behind the suffering were glimpses of tactical evolution. Artillery coordination had improved. Tanks, while still unreliable, were being integrated more effectively. Air power was playing a more active role. The tools of war were changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. On the German side, 1917 marked a shift toward defensive strategy. Having withdrawn to the Hindenburg Line earlier in the year, German forces focused on fortifying their positions. The new line was shorter and better protected, freeing up divisions for use elsewhere. German High Command understood that while they could not win quickly, they might still outlast their enemies, especially if they could force Britain and France into political collapse or economic exhaustion. To this end, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917. Their U-boats targeted not only enemy vessels, but also neutral shipping, including American ships. The goal was to cut off supplies to Britain and starve it into submission. In the short term, it was devastating. Ships were sunk at an alarming rate. But in the long term, it proved to be a strategic error. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Though the American army would take time to mobilize and train, its entry into the war shifted the balance of power. The vast industrial and human resources of the US promised eventual reinforcement for the exhausted Allied armies. For Germany, it meant that time was no longer on their side. The Eastern Front, meanwhile, was entering a new phase. The Russian Empire, strained by years of war and internal unrest, was beginning to collapse. In March 1917, the Tsar was overthrown in the February Revolution, as it was called in the West, owing to the Julian calendar. A provisional government attempted to maintain the war effort, but discipline and morale among Russian troops continued to deteriorate. By the end of the year, the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution and immediately sought peace with Germany. This would eventually lead to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, removing Russia from the war and allowing Germany to shift forces westward. But even as one front quieted, the Western Front braced for renewed intensity. At sea, the war continued to escalate. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 had left the British Royal Navy dominant but cautious. Blockades continued to restrict German imports, causing shortages and civilian hardship. German submarines, in turn, roamed the Atlantic, threatening supply routes. Convoys were introduced to protect merchant ships, and anti-submarine tactics slowly improved. The home fronts across Europe, already strained by years of conflict, began to feel the pressure more acutely. In Germany, the British naval blockade was taking its toll. Food shortages and inflation led to unrest. Bread riots and worker strikes increased. Political dissatisfaction simmered beneath the surface. The war was becoming harder to sustain. In Britain and France, the situation was similarly precarious. Despite propaganda efforts and patriotic fervour, fatigue was widespread. The Somme had marked a turning point in public perception. Now, with Passchendaele adding further pain, governments faced growing pressure to deliver results. Military leaders walked a fine line between bold action and disastrous overreach. Yet amid all the suffering and stagnation, the seeds of eventual victory were being sown. Slowly, new technologies were taking root. Doctrine was evolving. And with the promise of American support on the horizon, Allied planners began to think in terms not just of survival, but of eventual success. As 1917 drew to a close, the war remained a brutal stalemate, but it was no longer the same war that had begun in 1914. The world had changed. The soldiers had changed. The very structure of modern conflict was shifting. And though no one could see the end yet, the path toward it, uncertain, costly, and steep, had begun to emerge from the shadow of the Somme. Part 5. The Final Year, 1918, and the Road to Armistice. As the First World War entered its final year, the long shadow of the Somme still stretched across Europe. The strategies, losses, and lessons of 1916 had shaped the course of 1917, and by 1918, the war had become an altogether different kind of conflict, faster, more mobile, and even more desperate. The year would bring both the greatest German offensives of the war and ultimately the collapse of their resistance. What followed was not a single victory, but a series of grinding advances, each made possible by years of sacrifice, adaptation, and unrelenting pressure. The year began with uncertainty. Russia had exited the war following the Bolshevik Revolution and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, freeing up over 50 divisions of German troops to be redeployed to the Western Front. The Allies, for all their resolve, were stretched thin. The American army was not yet ready in numbers sufficient to turn the tide, and morale remained fragile on both sides of the line. Sensing an opportunity, German High Command launched a bold gamble. In the spring of 1918, they initiated the Spring Offensive, or Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. It consisted of a series of attacks intended to break the Allied lines before American reinforcements could arrive in full force. The initial phase, Operation Michael, launched in March, targeted the British-held sectors near the Somme. The German advance was dramatic, using stormtrooper tactics, fast-moving infantry units, trained to bypass strong points and strike deep into enemy lines. They broke through in several places. Towns and villages long held by the British were lost. The old battlefield of the Somme was retaken by German forces, and the Allies were forced into a hasty retreat. For a moment, it seemed the Germans might succeed in forcing a decision, but there were limits to their gains. The rapid advance outran their supply lines. Exhausted troops could not be replaced, and critically, the German army had no clear strategic objective beyond simply breaking through. The offensive lacked the logistics and momentum to deliver a final blow. The Allies, though reeling, held firm. French and British forces regrouped. The American Expeditionary Force, under General John J. Pershing, began to arrive in greater numbers. Their presence buoyed Allied morale and filled critical gaps. By summer, the initiative had shifted. In July, the Second Battle of the Marne marked a turning point. A failed German offensive there allowed the Allies to counterattack. What followed was a series of coordinated advances known as the 100 Days Offensive. Beginning in August with the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian and French troops launched a sustained push along a wide front. This offensive was different. It featured greater coordination between infantry, tanks, artillery and aircraft. Lessons from the Somme and Passchendaele were finally bearing fruit. Artillery was more precise. Tanks, though still limited in number, helped break through trench systems. Airplanes provided reconnaissance and ground support. Communication had improved. The advances were not without cost, but they were effective. The Germans, increasingly demoralized and running short on supplies, began to falter. The Hindenburg Line, once seen as impenetrable, was breached. The retreat became general. German commanders began to acknowledge what had become increasingly clear. The war could not be won. At home, Germany was collapsing. The British naval blockade continued to starve the population of essential goods. Food shortages, inflation, and growing unrest eroded public support for the war. Strikes and protests broke out in major cities. The German economy was in freefall, and political dissent was rising. By autumn, revolution was in the air. In October and November, mutinies broke out in the German Navy. Workers' and soldiers' councils formed across the country. The Kaiser's authority crumbled. On the 9th of November 1918, Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Germany declared itself a republic. 2 days later, on the morning of November 11th, 1918, representatives of the German government signed the armistice in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France. At 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. After more than 4 years of war, the fighting was over. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. The First World War had claimed the lives of over 16 million people, with millions more wounded, displaced or traumatized. The Somme alone had accounted for more than 1 million casualties. The legacy of the war would be felt for decades, in politics, in borders, in art, in memory. The final months of the war had shown what could be achieved with coordination, adaptation, and perseverance, but they had also demonstrated the sheer human and material cost required to break the stalemate that had defined so much of the war. The Allied victory was real, but it was not without complexity. The war had exposed the fragility of empires and the limits of military power. It had also sown the seeds of future conflict. The end of fighting did not bring immediate peace. The Versailles Treaty, signed in June 1919, would attempt to reshape Europe, but its terms would prove deeply controversial. Reparations, territorial losses, and national resentment, especially in Germany, would linger and grow. The post-war years would be marked by turmoil, recovery, and eventually the rumblings of another war. Still, in the final days of 1918, there was relief. Across Europe, church bells rang, crowds gathered, and weary soldiers embraced the end of battle. In the shattered towns of France and Belgium, survivors emerged from cellars. Families wrote letters home. The long nightmare was over, at least for now. The war that had begun with cavalry charges and coloured uniforms ended with tanks, machine guns, and chemical weapons. The world was different now. The map of Europe had changed. The psyche of nations had shifted, and in the silence after the guns, people began to ask, what had it all been for? The answer would take generations to unravel, but one thing was clear. The Somme and all that followed had reshaped the 20th century. Part 6. Memory and Mourning, Commemorating the Somme. In the quiet that followed the armistice, Europe was left to reckon with the unimaginable scale of its loss. The fields of the Somme, once thunderous with artillery and cries of battle, fell silent. But that silence did not mean peace. It became the backdrop for mourning, reflection, and the long, uneven process of remembrance. The memory of the Somme would not fade. It would evolve, ripple outward, and shape the way an entire generation understood sacrifice, duty, and the cost of war. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the need to honour the dead was overwhelming. Entire towns and villages in Britain had lost a generation of men. In some communities, entire battalions raised from local workers and friends had been wiped out in the opening days of the battle. The grief was not confined to families. It belonged to entire neighbourhoods, to cities, and to the nation itself. The British government, recognising the scale of national mourning, established the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1917, later renamed the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Its task was unprecedented: to identify, bury and honour the dead of the British Empire. Across the former battlefields of France and Belgium, cemeteries began to take shape. Rows of white headstones, many marked only as a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. The Somme, with its staggering casualties, became a particular focus. Cemeteries such as Thiepval, Sarah Road, and Beaumont Hamel marked the sites of intense fighting. Some, like the Newfoundland Memorial at Beaumont Hamel, preserved entire sections of battlefield, complete with trenches and shell holes, frozen in time as reminders of the fury that once engulfed them. The most iconic of these is the Thiepval Memorial to the missing of the Somme. Designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens and unveiled in 1932, it bears the names of more than 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died in the Somme sector and have no known grave. Towering above the rolling fields, it is not only an architectural statement, but a declaration. These lives will not be forgotten. Public mourning took many forms. Across Britain and its dominions, war memorials sprang up in town squares, school halls, churchyards, and factories. Some were simple plaques, others were grand statues or elaborate monuments. What they shared was a sense of local pride and personal loss. Each name etched in stone represented a son, a brother, a friend. The Somme was not a distant battle. It had come home with each telegram, each silence at the dinner table. Annual commemorations also became part of the national fabric. The first official Armistice Day was held on November 11th, 1919. At 11 a.m, the nation paused for 2 minutes of silence to honour the fallen. The tradition spread, becoming a solemn ritual repeated year after year. In time, poppies growing wild among the battlefields, and popularised by the poem In Flanders Fields, became symbols of remembrance. Literature and art added further dimensions to how the Somme was remembered. War poets such as Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg gave voice to the suffering and disillusionment felt by those who fought. Their words, often raw and unflinching, offered a counter-narrative to official histories. They described mud, terror, comradeship, and futility, not glory or triumph. In doing so, they helped shape a new, more honest understanding of the war. Visual artists also turned their attention to the war. Some, like Paul Nash and Christopher Nevinson, had served at the front and painted what they had seen. Their canvases showed blasted trees, desolate trenches, and haunted landscapes. The Somme was not portrayed as a place of victory, but as a symbol of destruction and endurance. This shift in tone also influenced how historians and educators approach the subject. For much of the 20th century, the Somme was taught not as a successful military campaign, but as a cautionary tale. The first day of the battle, 1st July 1916, remained the bloodiest in British military history, with nearly 60,000 casualties. That number became etched into public consciousness, a stark reminder of the human cost of poor planning and outdated tactics. Yet memory is never fixed. Over time, new generations asked different questions. Was the Somme truly a failure? Did it contribute meaningfully to the eventual Allied victory? Some military historians argued that despite its heavy losses, the battle helped wear down German strength and improve Allied coordination. Others maintained that its primary legacy was tragedy. In recent decades, remembrance has taken on new forms. Documentaries, books, and digital archives have made the history of the Somme more accessible than ever. Walking tours, educational programs, and interactive exhibits help visitors engage with the past. Pilgrimages to the battlefields have become common, particularly during anniversary years. For many, the journey is personal, a chance to stand where a grandfather or great-uncle once fought. The Somme also occupies a central place in debates about how societies remember war. Should commemoration focus on heroism or on suffering? Is it enough to build monuments, or must we also wrestle with the political and moral questions raised by the conflict? These questions do not have simple answers, but they remain vital. In France and Belgium, the legacy of the Somme is also preserved. Local communities maintain cemeteries, host visitors, and tell their own stories of occupation, destruction, and survival. The battlefields are not just British sites of memory, they are international spaces where history, identity, and reconciliation intersect. More than a century has passed since the guns fell silent along the Somme, but its memory endures. Each name on a headstone, each poppy pinned to a coat, each schoolchild learning about the trenches. These acts of remembrance, small and large, keep the past alive. The Somme is no longer just a place. It is an idea, a symbol of sacrifice, of resilience, of the human capacity to endure. It reminds us of what can be lost when nations choose war, but also of what can be honoured if we choose to remember. Part 7. Legacy, the Somme in the modern world. More than a century has passed since the Battle of the Somme was fought. Its trenches have long been reclaimed by earth and grass, its craters softened by time and rain. But the legacy of the Somme continues to shape how we understand war, memory, and the responsibility of remembrance in the modern world. It has become more than just a historical event. It is a lens through which we examine the past and question the future. The Somme's legacy can be seen in how nations remember and educate. In Britain, the First World War remains a core subject in school curricula. The story of the Somme is often the centerpiece, offering young people a gateway into the broader complexities of the conflict. Students read the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, study the tactical decisions of generals like Haig and Rawlinson, and try to understand how so many could be lost in a single day. Beyond classrooms, the Somme lives on through national remembrance. Each year on the 1st of July, services are held at memorials across the former battlefields. In the United Kingdom, wreaths are laid, names are read, and silence is observed. These rituals, while sombre, are also affirmations, a society choosing to remember rather than forget. Digital technology has added new dimensions to this remembrance. Online databases allow descendants to trace ancestors who fought in the war. Digitized war diaries, trench maps, and letters bring immediacy to the experience of soldiers. Virtual tours and 3D reconstructions of the Somme battlefield let users walk through recreated trenches and see the terrain as it was seen by those who lived and died there. These tools bring new generations into contact with the war in ways previously unimaginable. Internationally, the Somme has become a shared site of memory. France, Belgium, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and others each have their own stories linked to the battle. Pilgrimages to the Somme are made not only by historians and students, but by families, veterans, and tourists from around the world. Many come seeking a connection, to honour a relative, to stand in silence, to understand something of what was endured. Yet the Somme is not remembered universally in the same way. For some, it is a symbol of heroic sacrifice. For others, a tragic example of military failure. Still others see it as a warning of what can happen when pride, misunderstanding, and nationalism spiral into violence. These multiple interpretations reflect the battle's complexity and the ways memory evolves across cultures and generations. The Somme also continues to inform military thinking. The mistakes made in 1916, reliance on outdated tactics, poor communication, underestimation of the enemy, have become case studies in military academies around the world. But so too have the innovations. The early use of tanks, the integration of air reconnaissance, and the refinement of artillery coordination. The Somme remains a cautionary tale, but also a site of hard-won lessons. Culturally, the battle has influenced everything from literature to film, from memorial design to public discourse. Novels, plays, documentaries, and exhibitions return to the Somme again and again, each adding new perspectives. Some focus on the experience of soldiers, others on the politics of the war, and others still on the long shadow the battle cast over the 20th century. Politically, the Somme remains relevant as well. In times of crisis, governments and commentators sometimes draw on the language and imagery of the First World War. Phrases like lions led by donkeys or the war to end all wars resurface in headlines and speeches. The Somme has become a symbol, one that warns against complacency, reminds of the cost of conflict, and urges reflection before action. The physical landscape of the Somme also tells its story. Farmers still uncover shells, bullets, and even the remains of soldiers when ploughing their fields. Known as the Iron Harvest, this ongoing unearthing is a visceral reminder that the past is never entirely buried. In places, the terrain still bears the marks of war, trenches, craters, and dugouts softened by time, but unmistakable in their origin. These landscapes have become places of pilgrimage and education. Institutions like the Historial de la Grande Guerre and Péronne and the Thiepval Visitor Centre offer immersive experiences for those seeking to understand the battle. Walking tours led by local guides add personal insights, often passed down through generations. The Somme, once a place of destruction, is now a place of learning and reflection. The centenary of the battle in 2016 marked a particularly poignant moment. Ceremonies were held across the UK and France. Political leaders, royalty, veterans, and citizens gathered to honour those who fell. The events were broadcast globally, and millions paused to remember. It was a moment of unity across borders and generations, one that reaffirmed the enduring significance of the Somme. But as time passes, new challenges emerge. The last veterans of the First World War have now passed away. With no living memory to draw from, the responsibility for remembrance shifts more fully to historians, educators, families, and institutions. There is a risk, as with all history, that distance can dull meaning, that the Somme becomes not a lived memory, but a distant footnote. To guard against this, remembrance must be active, not only commemorative, but questioning, not only reverent, but engaged. The Somme invites us not just to mourn, but to ask, what causes such conflicts? What allows them to endure? And how can they be prevented? In today's world, these questions are more urgent than ever. Global tensions, political polarization, and the persistent threat of war make the lessons of the Somme deeply relevant. Its story reminds us of the human cost of division, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the resilience of those caught in the middle. The Somme does not offer simple answers, but it does offer perspective on leadership, on courage, on sacrifice, on the long road to peace. It asks us to remember, not just with our hearts, but with our minds. As the 21st century unfolds, the legacy of the Somme will continue, in books and classrooms, in memorials and digital archives, in silent fields, in northern France where poppies still bloom each summer. The names carved into stone will not fade, nor will the lessons drawn from them. The Somme endures because it matters. It endures because we choose to make it matter.